Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral and unceded homeland we live, work, and gather, the Nipmuc, the Massachusetts, and the Wampanoag. We acknowledge their ancestors as we seek to understand and remember the painful history of war, genocide, and forced removal of indigenous peoples by European settlers. Tonight, we gather as a living celebration of the indigenous story, a story that is not just part of the past, but is an ongoing part of our present and future as indigenous communities continue to live and make new history here. May we all make a commitment to deepen our relationship with indigenous communities as we work to be their allies in the ongoing search for truth, justice, and understanding. In 1675, the population of New England colonists totaled about 65,000 people. They lived in 110 towns, 64 of which were in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which then included the southwestern portion of Maine. The towns had about 16,000 men of military age who were almost all part of the militia, as universal training was mandatory in all colonial New England towns. This went back to March 1630, when the Bay Colony General Court established the first military legislation that required all adult males between 18 and 45, except for ministers and magistrates, to possess arms. Towns were to finish arms and later collect the costs to indigents. The first muster of full militia regiments in Massachusetts took place in 1636. As an aside, along with those 65,000 Europeans, there were about 10,000 Native Americans in New England, down from a total population of 100,000 in 1620. By the time of King Philip's War, many towns had built strong garrison houses for defense, while others had stockades enclosing most of the houses. All of these were strengthened as the war progressed. Some poorly populated towns were abandoned if they did not have enough men to defend them. The militias were usually only minimally trained and, initially, did poorly against the warring natives until more effective training and tactics could be devised. But what exactly was King Philip's War? Also known as the First Indian War, the Great Narragansett War, or Metacom's Rebellion, it took place in southern New England from 1675 to 1676. An alliance of Native American tribes under the Wampanoag Sachem, called Metacom or Metacomet, were unhappy with the increasing encroachment of English settlers onto native lands and attempted to eliminate these settlers. With that, the natives hoped to regain control of their former lands, continue their culture without outside influence, and put an end to the poor treatment they were receiving from the English. It was the Native Americans' last-ditch effort to avoid recognition of English authority and stop English encroachment on their New England lands. After the Pequot War, which was 1636-1637, the New England colonies of Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and New Haven realized the need to form a military alliance to defend against their common enemies, that is, the New England Native Americans. They formed the New England Confederation on May 19, 1643. This confederation would fight the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Pocmatuck, and Narragansett Indians during King Philip's War. It should be noted that some tribes fought with the English. After several disastrous losses, it was found that a combination of militia volunteers and volunteer native allies were the most effective in combating Metacomet's forces. The native allies of the colonists numbered about 1,000 warriors and were from the Mohegans, Pequots, and Mohawks, as well as warriors from the Christianized praying Indian towns, many of whom were Nipmuc. Who was King Philip? He was in reality Metacomet, the second son of Wampanoag chief Massasoit, who had negotiated a peace treaty with the colonists at Plymouth Plantation. But the agreement wasn't enough to stop the colonists' encroachment on native lands, and after Massasoit's death in 1661, his eldest son, Wamsuta, later named Alexander, succeeded him. In 1662, the English arrested Alexander on suspicion of plotting war against them. During questioning, he died of, quote, a sudden illness, and the Wampanoag believed that he had been poisoned because the English saw him as a threat. Because of his death, Metacom came to power. As Sachem, Metacom took the lead in his tribe's trade with the colonists. In time, he took the name King Philip to honor the relations between the colonists and his father, and even purchased European-style apparel in Boston. He signed an agreement with the English and vowed not to needlessly or unjustly provoke or raise war with any other natives. In return, the colonists agreed to advise and aid Philip. However, it was an uneasy alliance, and hostilities between natives and colonists continued to grow. In January 1675, a Christian Indian named John Sassamon warned Plymouth Colony that Metacomet planned to attack English settlements. The English ignored the warning, and Sassamon's murdered body was found in an icy pond. 3 Wampanoags were suspected and arrested, and a jury made up of colonists and praying Indians found them guilty for Sassamon's murder, and they were hanged on June 8, 1675. Their execution incensed Metacomet, whom the English had accused of plotting Sassamon's murder, and this ignited tensions between the Wampanoag and the colonists, setting the stage for war. Between June 20th and 23rd, 1675, the Wampanoag carried out a series of raids against Swansea, Massachusetts, killing many colonists and pillaging and destroying property. English officials responded by sending their military to destroy Philip's home in Mount Hope, Rhode Island. The war spread during the summer of 1675 as the Wampanoag, joined by warriors from other tribes, attacked settlements throughout Massachusetts. On September 9, 1675, the New England Confederation declared war against King Philip and his followers, which now included not only his Wampanoag, but warriors from the Nipmuc, Pocumtuck, and Narragansett tribes. A week later, around 700 Nipmuc Indians ambushed a militia group escorting a wagon train of colonists from Deerfield to Hadley. Almost all colonists and militia were killed in the fighting, which became known as the Battle of Bloody Brook. An aside, in the earlier Pequot War, when the Native Americans were solely armed with bow and arrow, armor was invaluable for the colonists. A number of occasions were recorded where body armor saved the English from bow-armed natives. However, the 50 subsequent years leading up to King Philip's War saw the vast majority of natives adopting muskets for hunting and warfare. So the lack of protection armor provided against musket fire, and the difficulty in trying to engage an elusive foe in the forest wearing such equipment, meant that nearly all troops, except perhaps some garrison town militia forces and or notable individuals, all but discarded the use of body armor. This change was also occurring in Europe by the 1670s, but was mostly complete in the New World for both practical and financial reasons. Therefore, the typical United Colony soldier wore civilian clothing into battle, perhaps supplemented with a buff coat for some protection from tomahawk blows, as well as providing general all-weather protection, with maybe a steel helmet for head protection. Soldiers also would have swords, hatchets, and knives with powder horns and pouches. This practical clothing greatly enhanced mobility, and given that each man had to supply his own equipment, it meant that costs were kept to an absolute minimum. Uniforms were functional, cheap, and practical. The principal weapon of King Philip's War was a musket, 74 caliber, extensively used by both sides, which very much defined the style of fighting each undertook. This represented the established orthodoxy of European-style tactics and the adapted way of war the natives developed since the musket's introduction. It should be noted that both matchlocks and flintlocks were used in the conflict, and needless to say, flintlocks were much preferred. They were not as cumbersome, easier to use, and far superior to the matchlock. In some instances, the English militia were also armed with pikes. In 1675, the natives of New England were also armed with flintlock muskets, and they had the technology to repair them. They also had the technology to mine lead and mold the bullets. However, they could not manufacture the muskets or make the gunpowder used to fire them. Many of the native raids were beneficial to the warriors in that they supplied them with the needed weapons, ammunition, and gunpowder. They also relied on Dutch, French traders, or dead English soldiers for their gunpowder as well. The natives were also armed with pistols, bows, war clubs, knives, and hatchets. In late 1676, King Philip's Confederacy continued to assault English colonies throughout Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maine. It seemed as if there was no safe place for colonists to hide. The natives attacked Plymouth Plantation and forced most of its citizens to the coast. A native force also annihilated Providence, Rhode Island. In the winter of 1676, a lull in the fighting occurred in eastern Massachusetts. But once the spring arrived, Native American forces resumed their raids on the area's Puritan towns. The Native Coalition attacked the strategically significant fort at Marlborough, Massachusetts, on both March 16th and April 7th, destroying most of the settlement and forcing a partial evacuation of its residents. In response to these attacks, as well as the recent abandonment of Lancaster and Groton, the Colonial Council of War dispatched Captain Samuel Wadsworth and 50 men to Marlborough to reinforce the frontier. Wadsworth's company passed through Sudbury on the evening of April 20th, 1676. Meanwhile, some 500 native warriors departed the Nipmuc stronghold on Mount Wachusett and gathered on Pompasiticate Hill, also known as Summer Hill and what is now Maynard, with the intent to attack Concord. After gathering the group together, they decided to attack Sudbury instead. Tradition holds that Metacom led the native army at the Sudbury fight, although there are no primary sources to corroborate it. Some historians have suggested that the Nipmuc Sachem Mudawump held overall command of the native force. Native warriors infiltrated Sudbury during the night of April 21st, 1676, and attacked at dawn, burning houses and barns, as well as killing several persons, according to Puritan historian William Hubbard. Many English residents of Sudbury, most of whom lived on the east bank of the Sudbury River in what is now present-day Wayland, abandoned their homes and sought refuge in the town's fortified garrison houses. The natives besieged the Haynes Garrison House on present-day Water Row Road, but faced a stout defense from the English civilians inside. At one point, the natives rolled a flaming cart full of flax downhill toward the garrison, but the wagon hit a rock and spilled over before doing any damage to the house. The Haynes garrison held throughout the battle, but some historians have speculated that the siege was actually a feint, meant to draw English reinforcements to the area so that the natives could attack them, and it worked. Hearing the alarm, about a dozen men of Concord marched to Sudbury's defense. They were ambushed and massacred within full view of the defenders of the Haynes garrison. Only 2 of the Concord men escaped with their lives and made it into the Haynes house. The dead would later be buried in a mass grave just east of the Old Town Bridge in Wayland. Flushed with victory, native forces crossed the river and set about pillaging the central settlement of Sudbury. Shortly before noon, English militiamen from Watertown, under the command of Captain Hugh Mason, arrived and successfully repelled the native forces, but the fighting was far from over. As Mason took back control of the town, Captain Wadsworth approached from the west with about 70 men, his numbers bolstered by Captain Samuel Brocklebank's garrison at Marlborough. Wadsworth's men had rested only briefly in Marlborough before their march to defend Sudbury. They were hungry, exhausted, and completely ignorant of their enemy's position. A mile from town, Wadsworth's men spotted about 100 armed natives darting off into the woods. Believing that they, quote, might easily be dealt with, the militia set off in pursuit. The natives led the militia to the low ground between what is now Goodman's Hill and Green Hill, where they sprang an ambush, surrounding the small English force. Wadsworth fought his way to the summit of Green Hill, ordering his men to form a square, and they repulsed multiple native charges. The fighting went on all afternoon. The Watertown militia and 2 companies of English dragoons repeatedly attempted to rescue Wadsworth, but ultimately failed to break the native envelopments, and they were forced to retreat. Native warriors then set fire to the dry brush of the hill, choking Wadsworth's beleaguered company with smoke. In a panic, the English broke and ran. Half the militiamen were killed in the rout, including Wadsworth. The survivors fled south toward the Goodnow Garrison House on Boston Post Road, where a company of infantry and some dragoons were regrouping. 13 of 14 militiamen also took refuge in the fortified Noyes grist mill until they were eventually rescued. According to Increase Mather, clergyman and later president of Harvard College, the natives, quote, took 5 or 6 of the English alive and stripped them naked and caused them to run the gauntlet, whipping them after a cruel and bloody manner, and then threw hot ashes upon them, cut the flesh of their legs, and put fire into their wounds, delighting to see the miserable torments of wretched creatures, unquote. There were also other claims that English captives were tortured, but Mary Rowlandson, a woman captured during a native attack on Lancaster, Massachusetts in February 1676 and held for some 11 weeks, was present in the native camp during the battle, and she makes no mention of torture in her memoirs. As night fell, the native forces withdrew from Sudbury. Early the next day, English soldiers, together with a group of allied praying Indians, went out to the battlefield to bury the dead. Mary Rowlandson claimed that despite their victory, morale among the native coalition was low after the Sudbury fight. She would write, quote, "They came home without that rejoicing and triumphing over their victory which they were wont to show at other times, but rather like dogs, as they say, which have lost their ears. Yet I could not perceive that it was for their own loss of men. They said they had not lost above 5 or 6, but I missed none except in one wigwam." Mather disagreed with Rowlandson, putting the native dead at, quote, 120, and in the autumn of 1676, prominent citizens of Sudbury recounted that they had made, quote, a considerable slaughter of native attackers. Today, most historians agree that the native loss was about 120 warriors. As for colonial losses, on the morning of April 22nd, native warriors taunted militiamen in Marlborough by shouting 74 times to indicate the number of their enemy they believed they had killed at Sudbury. In 1730, Samuel Wadsworth's son Benjamin, who was then the president of Harvard College, dedicated a memorial stone over the mass grave where his father had been buried alongside his men. In 1852, the remains of Wadsworth militia were excavated and reinterred 50 feet north to the site of a new monument near the base of Green Hill. Both memorials incorrectly date the Battle of Sudbury to April 18th, but this is likely an error, and it came from Hubbard. The date is April 21st in Mather's Contemporary Chronicle and in a letter dated April 21st, 1676, from the Colonial Government of Massachusetts Bay to Plymouth Colony. Governor Josiah Winslow stated, quote, "This day we have intelligence in the general that Sudbury was this morning assaulted and many houses burnt down." So it is agreed by most historians that April 21st was the date of the beginning of the Battle of Sudbury. A handful of other monuments and markers in Sudbury and Wayland commemorate the Sudbury fight, most of which were erected in the 1930s to celebrate Massachusetts' tricentennial. As most of you probably know, the battlefield around Goodman's Hill and Green Hill is now the site of an affluent residential neighborhood, and very little of what was the battlefield remains. Throughout the spring of 1676, the tide began to turn for the English. In April, Chief Canonchet was captured, handed over to the Mohegans and shot, beheaded and quartered, leaving the Narragansett without a leader. In May, the militia attacked and killed up to 200 Narragansett warriors at the Battle of Turner Falls, near the Connecticut River. By midsummer, the English started giving amnesty to some natives. A lot of war-weary warriors surrendered. However, the English then sold many of them into slavery. By the late summer of 1676, King Philip and his allies were severely weakened. On August 20th, 1676, an English Indian soldier named John Alderman shot and killed King Philip at Mount Hope, Rhode Island. His body was hanged, beheaded, and drawn and quartered. His head was placed on a spike and displayed at Plymouth for 2 decades. King Philip's death effectively ended the war, although clashes continued throughout New England until the Treaty of Casco was signed in 1678. It has been said that King Philip's War was the greatest calamity in 17th century New England. It is considered by many to be the deadliest war in colonial American history. In the space of little more than a year, 12 of the region's towns were destroyed and many more were damaged. The economy of Plymouth and Rhode Island colonies were all but ruined, and their population was decimated, losing 1/10 of all men available for military service. More than half of New England's towns were attacked by natives, and it is estimated that more than 1,000 colonists died in the war. In retaliation for the war, hundreds of Wampanoags and their allies were publicly executed or enslaved, and the Wampanoags were left effectively landless. Perhaps 300 natives died in the war. It decimated the Narragansett, Wampanoag, and many smaller tribes, and mostly ended Indian resistance in southern New England, paving the way for additional English settlements. King Philip would not be the only tribal leader to unite a confederation of tribes in order to fight the English and later American encroachment onto native lands. An Ottawa named Pontiac would create a pan-Indian resistance movement against European colonization in the Midwest in 1763. And the great Shawnee leader Tecumseh would lead a similar resistance movement in the Great Lakes region in the early 19th century. All of these movements had one thing in common. It was native peoples taking control of their lives and destiny in the hopes of getting rid of the European invaders. Metacom was just the first of these Native American freedom fighters.
So it's really hard when I was looking for images for this. You'll notice I did not have a lot or really any pictures of Native Americans. It's really hard to find period pictures that were not completely stereotypical racist. And so I really wanted to avoid this as much as I really could. So again, this is basically the Native American the nations that were here in the 17th century. The Nipmuc and Wampanoag kind of shared the same area. Most historians say that Concord was kind of the dividing line between the Wampanoag to the east and the Nipmuc to the west, and they shared the area. And they all called it the Concord Sudbury area. They all called it the Sudbury, of course, which is what they called the river, which nowadays is 3 rivers, the Sudbury, the Escalation, and Concord. So we have time for questions if you have any. Yes.
I just had a couple of questions. The obelisk that you showed, which was the, is that in Wadsworth Cemetery now? Oh, I found it. I was telling the other gentleman, actually, my ancestor died on April 21st, 1676 in Sudbury.
So are you? So you're a native Sudburian?
I am not.
No.
I moved here a year ago, and I found this as I was kind of getting rid of things before I moved up from Pennsylvania. I found some paperwork that I had not looked at for 20 years, and it traced my ancestry, if I should choose to belong to the daughters of the American Revolution, which I would not choose to, but, and then there was another one, and it traced my family all the way back to 1608, when the first person came from England. The name was Seaver, which Seaver, you know, there's thousands of us.
Was that
right?
the name of the person that was killed in the Sudbury fight?
Yes, Nathaniel Seaver.
Interesting.
And he, so, and then it said in Sudbury, Mass, and I'm moving there. So here he's still 400 years later. I moved to Sudbury. My other question was, so I have seen his kind of memorial there. He says to the 200 souls that died with me or whatever. But the other question is, was Sudbury destroyed?
A lot of the towns a lot of the homes were actually burned, of course, and then eventually rebuilt. So it was one of the largest attacks by Native forces during the King Philip's War. And Sudbury itself was hit pretty hard by the attack. Absolutely. Yeah. Questions? Rachel, are there any questions online?
Yes. How would you tell this story differently if you were to tell it through the eyes of Native Americans? What would the story look like through the lens of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States?
Which is a great book. I tried to be as balanced as I could. You know, this was obviously from the Native point of view. They were what I said in my lecture. They consider themselves freedom fighters, trying to get rid of the English influence. The 17th century was a time, especially here in New England, you had some natives who were absolutely against English encroachment and did their best to try to avoid that and fight that as much as possible. You had various tribes who worked with the English and tried to get along with them. The idea being, well, if we get along with them, maybe they won't treat us as badly. The so-called praying Indians being a good example of that, where a lot of the natives became Christianized and they adopted English clothing. They lived in English-style houses, thinking, oh, if you can't eat or enjoy it, maybe we'll get treated better. Again, the history of the praying Indians in New England is fraught with deceit by the English. Being a praying Indian did not necessarily keep them from being attacked or killed by the English or being enslaved and sent to Deer Island, places like that. So myself, as a historian, I would view the Native view as their freedom fighters standing up for trying to save their land. And this happened time and time again as the colonies eventually moved farther and farther west. As I said, it happened in the Great Lakes region in Pontiac. It happened in the Ohio country of Tecumseh. It happened in the far west with Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. Every section that the Europeans and later the Americans moved into, there were always Native, for lack of a better term, freedom fighters standing up, saying, hey, we can't have this happen. And almost a universal thing between Metacom, Pontiac, Tecumseh, Sitting Bull, they all tried to put together these Native American confederations, saying, look, we all have to stand together against these people so that we can have any hope of beating them. So they knew that there was going to be strength in numbers. I also don't think that they realized how many people there were, especially after the American Revolution, once the American colonies started moving and the American states started moving westward. I don't think the natives ever totally understood how many people were coming here to America, Europeans. They couldn't grasp the sheer numbers. That was part of the problem. Yes, sir.
Isn't this something that we shouldn't be using the past tense with? Because it seems to me that the Native Americans are still battling, taking of some of their property.
Absolutely.
It's not like it ends.
No, you're absolutely right. It's there's also the popular misconception that somehow the native peoples are extinct from America. Those of us who are historians and certainly people who we're aware that they are not extinct. A good example being, last week, 2 weeks ago at the Wayside, the Wampanoag were there burning in the shoe, a dugout canoe. Obviously, they're still here, and so, and as I said at the beginning of my lecture, we need to start fostering this understanding that it is not the past tense, that the native peoples are still in this area, they're still in our country. I've got a bumper sticker on my car that says "You are on Indian land," and you can use that bumper sticker anywhere.
And we have a senator who was mocked for saying she was related to Native Americans when in a place like Oklahoma,
Right.
you would suspect that it wouldn't take much to have some Native American background.
Yeah, I mean, it takes, all it takes, and this sounds easier than it really is, all it takes is peace, love, and understanding, right? But sometimes it feels like peace, love, and understanding are not that easy to obtain.
Let's go to another one. Were the Plymouth colonists affected by the native movements?
Absolutely, sure, very much so. During King Philip's War, Plymouth Plantation was attacked by Metacom's forces. And if you've been to Plymouth Plantation, they do an amazing job of relating Native history down there. And in fact, it's not even, they don't even call it Plymouth Plantation anymore. They changed the name. I think it's Plymouth Pawtucket is what they're calling it. But they are now giving 50-50 interpretation to both the English and the Native American history of the area. So that's a step in the right direction. Yeah, Plymouth had from the very minute the Pilgrims landed, Plymouth had a very uneasy up and down relationship with the natives of the area. Absolutely.
Well,
Go ahead, Sam.
I just had a question. Would you be able to repeat the name of that book? Because my next question is about what are some really good current resources we might be able to read. But you said, was it author Ortiz?
Yes, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz.
Okay.
And the book is called An Indigenous People's History of the United States.
An Indigenous People's History of the United States,
Thank you.
which is carried at the shop at Walter Pond.
You should get it here.
But and I've been reading it and rereading it. It came out. It's not that new of a book. It's been around for a while. But if you want to get a really great balance, well, not even balance, another opinion of the history of the United States, I highly suggest it. It's an amazing book. Absolutely.
Another question. Were the Native American fighters in this war Nipmuc or Wampanoag, or a combination of both?
Were they again?
Nipmuc, Wampanoag, or a combination of both?
Combination. Although the attack on Sudbury seems to have been, from what I read, seems to have been mostly Nipmuc.
So the tribes work together.
Absolutely.
Against this common.
Yeah, Metacom, he absolutely knew that they had to work together if they were going to have any success. And they actually did. They had a lot of success in the year that they were together, or that the war lasted. But again, just sheer numbers began to go against them.
I was interested that there was such a small number of soldiers. I'm thinking about my ancestor, hoping he wasn't tortured the way you described. Some of the English were.
Well, just for the record, torturing went on both sides.
Well, yeah, I'm sure it did. But just thinking, I just hadn't thought of that concept. I just didn't know. But anyway.
Good your hand up.
Goodman is the Goodman's Hill. So where does that come from? Because that has to be a reference to some native settlers.
Sally, do you know anything about Goodman's Hill?
Right. It was Cato who dealt with the land exchange and
Right.
then lived up on Goodman's Hill.
But who was
Cato was in there.
Cato,
No, Cato was Goodman.
yes,
Yeah.
they changed his name to give him.
Yeah, so a lot of the native peoples in this area, they also had, a lot of them had English names. They either taking an English name or given an English name, quote unquote, showing the respect between the Puritans and the natives. So, but, yeah, King Philip took that name, King Philip. I prefer to call them by their original names. I think that's more respectful. Yes, sir.
I don't know if you've been down to Plymouth, and they have an installation, not just for the Pilgrims, but also for the Native Americans. And one thing that impressed me was, as someone who's always cold, that it was very impressive to see in the native housing, the whole place was, in general, it was warm. And where the, I don't know what to call it, English, I would call them, where they were living, you either had to be close to the fireplace or you were relatively cold. And it just seemed like the idea of who's got the more culture. In some ways, it seemed to me that the Native Americans were leading the league.
Well, if you've ever spent a winter night in either a lean-to or a wigwam or a teepee or any other native dwelling, they're really warm. They're designed very well.
Yeah.
And also, the English that came to Massachusetts, they were pretty shocked by the New England winters, whereas the natives, of course, were completely used to it.
Right.
Yeah, these poor people from England. Can you imagine being here in January? Well, it's like to be here in January. Imagine never having experienced it before. I was recently talking to a man from Brazil. Last winter was his first winter here, and he wasn't a big fan of it.
Were they smoking? The wigwams. I always think of them, how
Because there's a hole in the top,
But-
and so
but you
there's
have
a
to have a
draft.
draft.
There's a nice draft. Yeah.
Well, what happens when the wind's going the other way? It's must push
You
it
could
down.
get smoky,
Yeah.
sure. Any more questions?
We have a few more from online.
Okay.
What specific attributes were built into the garrison houses that made them so resilient?
They had basically they were, think of like a log cabin fort almost, but also they would have the heavy shutters that you could put in front of the windows. A lot of times they would have peepholes that you could fire the muskets through. So they were basically, they were for all intents and purposes, they were forts.
Are there any of those left in Sudbury?
Not around here.
All right, for the 400th of the Mayflower, in order to have a more balanced commemoration and telling of the story, Native peoples' participation in the framing and formulation of the story, telling and commemoration, have the various tribes been contacted by the speaker and Sudbury Historical Society for their view and input on the telling of the history of King Philip's War and European settlement on their land?
Well, when we have a native exhibit here in the Historical Society, Rachel and I reached out to the Nipmuc Nation for that. As I said, the Wayside just did a great program with the Wampanoag people. Is it the Mashpee Wampanoag?
We had Nipmuc as well,
Yeah,
coming
and
together, yeah.
So
We talked
at
about
least in Sudbury, the Historical Society and the Wayside, they've been reaching out to the native peoples whenever they do anything. I would imagine Plymouth to me seems to be much more interested, Plymouth Plantation, much more interested in getting the native point of view as well with their exhibits and their program. So I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not involved with Plymouth. Not yet.
On Green Hill, there's an Indian grinding stone, and I've looked for it, and I keep finding it. So how do I find it?
a little overgrown, right, Rachel?
I believe so, yeah. What was a straw that broke the camel's back and started the war?
The fact that they had, they killed the one Native American and they blamed Metacom for it. And he then realized that the English were going to start causing trouble and blaming him for the death of this praying Indian gentleman. So it was an uneasy peace to begin with. You know, I think that both sides were very wary of each other. The natives, especially Metacom, and even though he did his best to get along with the English, I don't think that he ever totally trusted them. And probably vice versa as well. So it was always a very uneasy peace.
So you said the soldiers came from the Watertown garrison?
One of the garrisons, yeah.
So I think, I'm not sure if my ancestor is more from Roxbury, but I guess if they've all been a certain age, had to join the military.
Right, every man in Massachusetts had to be in the
So
militia.
they took them from wherever.
Yeah, and every town had its militia. And if you think back, or if you think ahead 100 years to 1775, again, every town had its militia. So at the Battle of Concord on April 19th, you had the militia from Sudbury and Acton and Concord and Bedford, and they all went to Concord for the Battle of Concord. That idea of every town having its militia, that got started 100 years earlier in Massachusetts.
Native Americans were on this land in Sudbury for tens of thousands of years before the European colonizers arrived. How do you understand the European colonizers' belief that this land belonged to them, the colonizers?
Well, King James said it was given to them by God. And so that was their reason, that this land had been given to them by God. And a little known fact is that when the English started arriving in the early 17th century, a lot of native peoples had already been decimated by disease because of English fishermen up in Finland and other nations. Disease spread rapidly. And so when the Puritans started landing in Massachusetts, they were finding whole villages that were completely empty because the people had died from disease. And King James himself said that that was a sign that God wanted the English to have this land because he had sent this pestilence to them to be wiped out. So they were doing it because God said they could.
Okay. Were Native Americans still dying in great numbers from European diseases by the start of the war, or was that this something in the past or distant past? If so, was this a factor in the war?
You know, I don't know if it was a factor in the war, but the diseases were always affecting the natives. Absolutely. Even after King Philip's War. And the disease would then eventually affect the natives in the Midwest and affect the natives in the far west.
It didn't affect the colonists.
They seem to have had a better immunity to it than the natives had. And we're talking about not just like fever and cholera and tuberculosis, but even like influenza. The natives just had, their bodies did not have any sort of immunity against any of these things.
Cato, so named for his diplomacy, and remember that not all tribal members participated in warfare. The so-called Christian Indians of Neshoba and Hassamanusett and many others who tried to negotiate were discriminated against brutally. Many of the Christian Indians got pneumonia when they adopted English dress and an English house in
Exactly.
I don't speak to that at all. Yeah. And another comment is, a good book to read on the political dynamic of the era is Mayflower by Nathaniel Philbrick.
Yep.
His writings on historic subjects is very well researched from primary resources.
I think what we'll do, will this recording be available? What we'll do is maybe we can put a link below with all of the various books, and there's some other books that I would be able to suggest as well. So maybe I'll put together a review list from this one.
Perfect. Yeah.
So.
Are there any other? That was the end of the questions.
Any more questions here? Yes.
It's not really about the Sudbury War, but I'm just interested when the Revolutionary War broke out. These tribes picked sides at all, or were they not involved at all?
not in Massachusetts, but in the general war itself, yeah, the Iroquois, most of the Iroquois, there are 6 nations in the Iroquois Confederation. Most of the Iroquois fought with the English. All of the Ohio tribes fought with the English. Some of the Cherokee fought with the Americans, others fought with the English. The so-called civilized tribes, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, some fought with the English. So they were kind of divided. But the vast majority of natives east of the Mississippi fought with the English against the Americans in the Revolution. In fact, after the Revolution ended in 1783, the so-called Indian War in Ohio, in Kentucky, and that the Old Northwest, that continued for 10 more years until 1795. And there were pitched battles between the young American army and the Ohio tribes led by Tecumseh. So Indian fighting, as it was known back then, the Native Wars, basically started in the early 1600s and continued until the 1890s, just moved farther and farther west. Yeah. Same ideas, different tribes. So great crowd here. Thank you so much for the people that have been tuning in. Thank you so much for Rachel, the Sudbury Historical Society, for having me. And thanks for joining me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.